Imagine you've been granted this temporary shield,
Yeah,
temporary protected status, TPS. It lets you live, work legally in the U.S. because things back home are just terrible. War, disaster, some deep crisis. For hundreds of thousands, it's a lifeline. What happens when the government that gave you that lifeline suddenly yanks it away?
yeah. That sudden reversal, that's exactly what put this huge issue, humanitarian illegal, right before the Supreme Court. We're diving into the court's order from October 3rd, 2025. The case is Noem versus National TPS Alliance, and it's specifically about TPS for Venezuelans. First, it's protection, and now, well, it's immediate termination.
And this isn't just some dry legal argument, right? It feels like a real clash. Our sources, they show this tension. You have the executive branch, a new administration trying to, change course fast. And then you have the lower courts pushing back saying, hold on, that's not legal.
Exactly. And remember the background. The government itself had found Venezuela was facing, and this is a quote, the worst humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere in recent memory. That finding led to granting TPS, promising stability until 2026. Then, boom, a new Secretary of Homeland Security tries to pull the plug way early.
So what was the immediate result from Supreme Court's October 3rd order?
Okay, so the court granted the Secretary of Homeland Security's request for a stay. Now, stay is basically a pause. It stops the lower court rulings from taking effect while the government appeals. The practical impact. The termination of TPS for Venezuelans can go ahead right now, even as the legal battle continues.
Wow. Okay. And important detail you mentioned.
Yeah,
This stay, it only affects the Venezuelan nationals, right? Not Haitians, even though they were part of the lower court case.
that's right. The government's application for the stay specifically targeted the Venezuelan TPS designation. Haiti wasn't part of this particular emergency request to the Supreme Court.
Okay, let's back up a bit then. We should probably ground ourselves in what TPS actually is. We know it shields people from removal, lets them work. But what were the specific legal reasons, the conditions that made the government keep renewing it for Venezuelans year after year?
Right, so the law is 8 U.S.C. Section 1254A. And the whole point is, well, simple. Don't send people back into a disaster zone or a profound crisis. And the facts the government used for Venezuela, they weren't just, vague concerns. They were specific and pretty devastating.
Can you give us some of that detail? Because the justification seems really key here, especially given the later reversal.
Sure. So January 2021, the initial designation called it the worst humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere in recent memory. Then March 2021, they detailed a severe political and economic crisis. Think deepening poverty, basic services collapsing, water, healthcare plus widespread human rights abuses. And these weren't one-off findings. They restated these conclusions again and again. September 2022, October 2023, and even as recently as January 2025.
So the government itself was consistently saying Venezuela is in a terrible state, people can't safely return.
Exactly. That was the official repeated position.
And that last extension, the one in January 2025, that came with a legal guarantee, didn't it? A specific time frame.
It did, and this is crucial. The TPS statute itself has a rule, Section 1254AB3. It says when TPS is extended, the protection must remain effective until the end date of that most recent previous extension. So the January 2025 extension locked in protection for Venezuelans until at least October 2nd, 2026. That was supposed to be the deal.
Okay, so the stage is set. A recognized crisis, repeated extensions, and a legal promise of stability until late 2026. Then comes the disruption. A new administration takes office in late January 2025. What exactly did the new secretary, Noem, do?
Well, shortly after President Trump took office, Secretary Noem announced that TPS for around 300,000 Venezuelans would end much, much earlier, April 2025, which, as you can see, directly contradicted that statutory requirement we just talked about. The law said the status had to last until October 2026. The secretary tried to cut it short by about 18 months.
So how did the government justify that? If the law seems clear, must remain effective until the previous extension expires, what was their argument for ending it early?
This is where it gets into the weeds of government notices and legal interpretation. Essentially, the administration argued that the January 2025 notice for Venezuela wasn't technically an extension of the underlying designation of Venezuela for TPS. They tried to frame it as merely a renewal of the eligibility documentation for individuals. They claimed this semantic difference gave them the power to terminate the underlying designation itself on a faster timeline, separate from that October 2026 date.
Okay, so a distinction between extending the whole country's TPS designation versus just renewing the paperwork for people already in the system.
That was the crux of their argument, yes. A fine distinction, perhaps, but one with massive consequences for 300,000 people.
And the lower courts? Did they accept this distinction?
No, they really didn't. This is where Justice Jackson's dissent later highlighted that strength of the lower court record. Federal courts looked at this argument 5 different times, 5,
Yeah.
and found the Secretary's action was unlawful, or at least likely unlawful.
5 times? That's quite something. Across different courts.
Yes, rulings from the Northern District of California, affirmed or upheld in principle by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Different judges, different stages of the litigation, but the same basic conclusion. The attempt to shorten the TPS period violated the statute. They looked at the law's text, its purpose providing stability, and said this early termination wasn't permissible.
So that consistent pushback led the district court eventually to issue a final judgment, right? To formally set aside or vacate the Secretary's termination order. What does vacate mean in practice?
Vacori. It basically means the court wiped the Secretary's termination off the books. Legally, it's as if it never happened. The effect was to restore the status quo. TPS for Venezuelans would continue until October 2026, as required by the January 2025 extension. The lower court said, the law requires stability, the termination was illegal, so the protection stays.
Okay. But the administration didn't just accept that final judgment. They went back to the Supreme Court.
Correct. They had already asked the Supreme Court for a stay back in May 2025 when the lower court issued a preliminary injunction, and the court had granted that temporary stay. Now, after losing the final judgment on the merits in the district court, the government came back asking for another stay, this time to pause that final ruling while they appealed it formally to the Ninth Circuit.
And this puts us into the realm of the Supreme Court's emergency docket, right? Sometimes called the shadow docket. Can you unpack that for us? Why is using this docket controversial here?
Sure. So the main docket is for cases getting the full treatment. Extensive briefings, oral arguments, detailed opinions. It takes time. The emergency docket handles urgent requests like applications for stays or injunctions needed before the full appeal process can finish. Think imminent executions, election deadlines, or, as here, a government policy set to change immediately. The controversy comes because these decisions often happen very quickly, sometimes with less briefing, and crucially, the majority often doesn't provide extensive reasoning for its decision. Critics worry it bypasses the normal, more transparent process, especially for major policy issues.
So the Supreme Court majority, using this emergency docket, granted the government's request for a stay. They paused the lower court's final ruling. What reason did they give for basically overriding that strong lower court consensus and doing it quickly?
Their reasoning was quite brief. They essentially said that even though the case had progressed from a preliminary stage to a final judgment, the core legal arguments and the assessment of harms hadn't significantly changed since they first granted a stay back in May. So, because the fundamentals were similar, they felt the same outcome granting the stay was warranted. Justices Sotomayor and Kagan indicated they would have denied the stay.
Okay, procedural consistency from the majority's view. But there was a dissent, led by Justice Jackson, and her argument sounded quite different.
Very different. Justice Jackson's dissent wasn't focused just on procedure. It was a forceful critique of how the court used its emergency power here. She argued the court failed to recognize the incredibly high burden the government should meet when asking to override a final reasoned judgment, especially one affecting so many lives so drastically. She posed the central question: what happens now to these 300,000 people? Should they keep the stability promised just months earlier, or be thrown into chaos, job loss, family separation, and deportation, back to a place the government itself deemed unsafe?
That really brings the human element to the forefront.
Absolutely.
Yep.
She accused the majority of ignoring the obvious, i.e., least disruptive and most humane answer reached by the lower courts, which was to maintain stability. She stated very clearly that the government hadn't shown any urgent, time-sensitive need for itself that would justify immediately overriding 5 lower court decisions.
It sounds like she saw it as a misuse of the emergency docket.
She called it exactly that,
Yeah.
a grave misuse of our emergency docket. She argued the majority was letting the administration disrupt as many lives as possible, as quickly as possible, by wordlessly setting aside the lower court's careful judgments. Her critique was that the court wrongly prioritized the government's bald assertion of unconstrained executive power over the real, documented harm to families who had relied on the government's earlier promise.
Okay, let's make this concrete for our listeners. The Supreme Court grants the stay. The termination is back on. What does that actually mean right now for a Venezuelan family relying on TPS?
It means immediate, profound instability. That stay effectively reactivated Secretary Noem's termination order. So their legal status. Gone, pending further appeals. Their work authorization, tied to TPS, no longer valid. Access to certain services cut off. And the biggest fear, protection from removal disappears. They are suddenly vulnerable to being detained and deported back to Venezuela, the very crisis the U.S. government acknowledged. The rug is pulled out from under them.
So boiling it down, we have these two opposing views presented in the sources about what this Supreme Court action signifies.
Right. On one hand, the majority's action reflects a view that the executive branch needs leeway to implement its policies, even while appeals are ongoing. They see this day as a procedural tool to maintain the government's perceived authority during litigation, arguing the legal factors hadn't changed enough since May.
And the counterview from the dissent.
The dissent argues that emergency stays, especially ones overriding multiple lower courts and causing massive human disruption, require extraordinary justification. It says the court should have prioritized the stability promised by law and confirmed by lower courts, rather than facilitating the administration's desire for rapid policy change at such a high human cost. It emphasizes judicial restraint and the severe, irreparable harm.
It really highlights this fundamental tension, doesn't it? Our legal system allows for appeals, for stays, it's built on process. But this case makes you ask, when does the sheer weight of evidence, the repeated findings of illegality by lower courts, the documented human cost to 300,000 people, when does that outweigh an administration's procedural right to keep fighting for its policy on the emergency docket?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it forces a deeper look at what constitutes a true emergency, justifying the Supreme Court's rapid intervention. Was the emergency the government potentially being delayed in implementing its policy change? Or was it the imminent loss of status, work, and safety for hundreds of thousands? How the court answers that, especially through its use of the emergency docket, signals a lot about its current approach to executive power, judicial review, and maybe even its own role. It's definitely something to keep watching as this case goes back to the Ninth Circuit and maybe eventually returns to the Supreme Court on the main docket.